The pain hit Dorothy like lightning at 3:47 in the morning. She'd been reaching for her reading glasses on a nightstand when it struck, a crushing weight across her chest that made her gasp and stumble backward on her bed. At 72, Dorothy had weathered plenty of storms in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of raw terror when she realized she might be having a heart attack, completely alone in her quiet suburban home. Her husband Robert had passed 3 years ago, and her children lived states away. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Chun, but Dorothy couldn't even remember if she was still traveling to visit her grandchildren. As the pain radiated down her left arm and her breathing became shallow, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: true helplessness. But here's what makes Dorothy's story remarkable. She didn't panic. Instead, she drew upon a lifetime of emotional wisdom and the kind of practical knowledge that comes with life after 60. You see, Dorothy belonged to that generation of seniors who understood that independent living meant being prepared for anything, even the unthinkable. As waves of pain washed over her, Dorothy remembered a conversation she'd had with her doctor just months earlier about senior empowerment and taking charge of her health. She thought about the CPR class she'd taken at the community center, not to help others, but to understand what was happening to her own body. Most importantly, she recalled the 7 critical steps her cardiologist had shared, steps that could mean the difference between life and death when you're facing a heart attack alone. Dorothy's trembling fingers reached for her phone, but not to call 911. Not yet. She knew that in these precious first minutes, there were specific actions she needed to take that could save her life before help arrived. Actions that every person over 60 should know by heart, because the statistics are sobering. Nearly 80% of cardiac arrests happen at home, and for seniors living independently, knowing these life-saving techniques isn't just helpful, it's essential. What Dorothy did next in those crucial moments would later astonish her cardiologist and become a teaching story for other seniors facing the realities of aging gracefully while maintaining their independence. She transformed from victim to survivor using knowledge that had been right at her fingertips all along. The pain was getting worse, and Dorothy could feel her heart rhythm becoming irregular. She looked at her phone, then at the bottle of aspirin on her nightstand, then made a decision that would save her life. But it wasn't the decision most people would expect. In the next few minutes, Dorothy would put into practice all 7 life-saving techniques that turned a potentially fatal heart attack into a story of triumph. Her actions that night didn't just save her life. They proved that with the right knowledge and emotional strength, seniors can take control even in the most frightening medical emergencies. But what exactly did Dorothy do in those critical first moments? And why didn't she immediately reach for her phone to call for help? The answer might surprise you, and it could save your life too. Dorothy had always been the strong one. Through 47 years of marriage, she was the one who handled the household emergencies while Robert managed the finances. She'd bandaged scraped knees, stayed calm during her son's asthma attacks, and even performed CPR on a neighbor's dog once. But life after retirement had changed her perspective on what it meant to be truly prepared. When Robert passed away suddenly from stroke, Dorothy faced a devastating reality check. She realized how much she'd relied on having someone else there, someone to share the burden of daily decisions and unexpected crises. The first year was the hardest, not just the grief, but the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that came with senior reflection on her new reality. She'd spent months questioning everything, wondering if she should move to assisted living, if independent living was just too risky at her age. But Dorothy possessed something that many people lose as they age, an unshakable belief in her own capacity to grow. Instead of retreating into fear, she began what she now called her empowerment education. She took first aid classes, learned basic home maintenance, and most importantly, she cultivated relationships with her medical team that went beyond just showing up for appointments. Dr. Martinez, her cardiologist, had become more than just a doctor. He was a teacher. During her last visit, he'd shared statistics that initially frightened her. Women over 65 often experienced different heart attack symptoms than younger people, and those living alone had significantly higher mortality rates. But instead of leaving her with fear, he'd equipped her with knowledge. Those 7 techniques he'd taught her weren't just medical advice. They were tools for finding purpose in this new chapter of her life. The irony wasn't lost on Dorothy that she'd learned more about her own body and health in the 3 years since Robert's death than the previous 30 years combined. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about discovering emotional resilience she never knew she possessed. She joined a senior support group where they shared practical wisdom about aging, from managing medications to recognizing warning signs of various health issues. Her children worried constantly, calling twice a week to check on her. They meant well, but Dorothy knew they couldn't understand that this phase of life after retirement wasn't about decline. It was about transformation. She found a different kind of strength in solitude, a confidence that came from proving to herself daily that she could handle whatever came her way. Now, as the chest pain intensified and her left arm began to tingle, Dorothy drew upon every lesson she'd learned. She thought about the widow in her support group who'd survived a heart attack by following the exact steps Dr. Martinez had taught them. She remembered the breathing techniques from her yoga class, the meditation practices that had helped her through grief, and most importantly, the systematic approach to medical emergencies that had become second nature. The clock on her nightstand read 3:52 a.m. 5 minutes had passed since the pain began, and Dorothy knew that every second mattered. But she also knew that panic would be her enemy, and preparation would be her salvation. As she reached for the aspirin bottle with trembling hands, Dorothy's phone buzzed with a text message. Her daughter Sarah, 3 time zones away in California, was awake with her newborn and sending one of her usual late-night check-ins. "Hope you're sleeping well, Mom. Love you." The irony of the timing hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Here was her daughter, probably bouncing a crying baby, worried about her elderly mother's well-being, completely unaware that her worst fears were unfolding in real time. Dorothy stared at the phone, her finger hovering over Sarah's contact. One call would bring her daughter racing across the country, would validate every concern her children had expressed about her living alone. But it would also mean the end of everything she'd fought so hard to preserve. The independence, the dignity, the proof that she could handle her own late-life choices without becoming a burden. She thought about the family meeting 6 months ago when her son David had flown in from Chicago with brochures for senior living communities. "Mom, we're not saying you can't take care of yourself," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're just saying you shouldn't have to face everything alone." Sarah had nodded in agreement, adding, "What if something happens and we can't get to you in time?" Dorothy had fought them then, insisting that aging with dignity meant maintaining control over her own life, her own decisions. She'd won that battle, but barely. The compromise had been daily check-ins, medical alert jewelry she refused to wear, and promises to be reasonable about her limitations. Now, as another wave of pain coursed through her chest, she wondered if her stubbornness had been wisdom or foolishness. The aspirin bottle felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Dr. Martinez had been clear about the protocol, but he'd also warned her about the critical importance of timing. If she was wrong about what was happening, if this was just anxiety or heartburn, calling 911 would mean embarrassment, false alarms, and her children's renewed pressure to give up her independence. But if she was right and she waited too long, if she tried to handle this alone and failed, she'd be proving every fear they'd ever voiced about her living situation. Dorothy closed her eyes and felt the weight of every conversation she'd ever had about second chances. Robert had always said she was too proud for her own good, that asking for help wasn't defeat. But Robert had never understood what it meant to watch your adult children look at you with a mixture of love and pity, to see yourself transform from protector to protected. The pain was spreading now, a crushing sensation that made her breath come in short gasps. Her phone lay beside her, Sarah's loving message still glowing on the screen. In the next few moments, Dorothy would have to choose between the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain and the reality that some battles aren't meant to be fought alone. Then her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in over 15 years, her sister Margaret. Dorothy's finger froze over the decline button as memories flooded back. Margaret, 2 years younger, had been her closest confidant until a bitter argument over their mother's care had torn them apart. They'd chosen different paths then. Dorothy believing in keeping their mother at home despite the challenges, Margaret insisting on professional care. The fight had been about more than logistics. It had been about duty, sacrifice, and what it meant to love someone enough to make impossible choices. Dorothy, Margaret's voice was strained, older, but unmistakably familiar. I know it's been forever, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I couldn't sleep. I had the strangest feeling that you needed me. Dorothy tried to speak, but could only manage a weak gasp. The irony was overwhelming. Here was the sister she'd lost over questions of independence and care, calling at the exact moment when Dorothy faced the same impossible choice their mother once had. "Dorothy? Are you there? You sound, oh my God, are you okay?" "Margaret," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think I'm having a heart attack." The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat before Margaret's voice returned, clear and commanding in a way that transported Dorothy back 30 years to when they were young mothers helping each other through midnight emergencies. "Listen to me carefully. Are you alone? Can you get to your medications?" "I'm alone," Dorothy managed. "I have aspirin, but Margaret, I don't know if I should call the kids. They'll use this to—" "Stop." Margaret's voice was firm but gentle. "Dorothy, do you remember what you told me when Mom had her first heart episode? You said that loving someone meant making the hard choices, even when they didn't like it, even when it meant swallowing your pride." Dorothy closed her eyes, remembering. She'd been so certain then, so sure that keeping their mother at home was the right choice. But Margaret had been thinking about their mother's safety, her well-being beyond just physical comfort. In this moment of rediscovery after 60, Dorothy finally understood what her sister had been trying to tell her all those years ago. "I was wrong about so many things," Dorothy whispered. "The way we fought, the things I said about you not caring enough. We were both trying to love her the best way we knew how," Margaret replied. "Just like your children are trying to love you. But right now, we need to focus on keeping you alive so we can have new beginnings instead of regrets." Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest, and it wasn't just the physical pain. This unexpected reconnection was offering her something she thought she'd lost forever: the chance for healing family bonds and the wisdom to accept help without losing herself. "Margaret, I need you to stay on the line and help me through this," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger even as her body weakened. "But first, I need to tell you something I should have said 15 years ago. You were right about Mom. You weren't trying to abandon her. You were trying to save her." Margaret's sharp intake of breath was audible across the miles. "Dorothy, we could talk about all of this later. Right now, tell me what Dr. Martinez taught you about those 7 steps. I know you remember them because you never forget anything important." As Dorothy began to recite the life-saving protocol, something extraordinary happened. Her panic transformed into purpose. With Margaret's calm voice anchoring her, she methodically chewed the aspirin, positioned herself correctly, and began the controlled breathing that would help her heart maintain its rhythm. But more than that, she realized this moment wasn't about choosing between independence and dependence. It was about recognizing that wisdom with age meant understanding the difference between stubborn pride and genuine strength. "I'm calling 911 now," Dorothy said, reaching for her phone with steady hands. "And then I'm calling Sarah and David." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked gently. "What about your independence?" Dorothy felt a smile cross her face despite the pain. "I'm discovering that real independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about being strong enough to build a life where I can choose who I want by my side." This was her life's turning point after 60, and she was finally ready to embrace it. As she dialed emergency services, Dorothy made another call that surprised even herself. She conference called both her children, her voice calm and clear as she explained the situation. "I'm having a medical emergency, but I'm handling it. I want you both to know that I'm okay with whatever changes need to happen next, because I've realized something important tonight." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Mom, we're booking flights right now." "I know you are," Dorothy replied, "and I'm grateful. But here's what I need you to understand. I'm not calling because I'm giving up my independence. I'm calling because I've learned that independence means having people you can count on, not proving you don't need it. The paramedic sirens were growing louder in the distance, but Dorothy felt calmer than she had in years. Margaret was still on the line. Her children were on their way. And for the first time since Robert's death, Dorothy understood that emotional closure didn't come from perfect self-reliance. It came from the courage to remain vulnerable enough to love and be loved, even when life became uncertain. "Margaret," she whispered as the emergency responders knocked on her door, "thank you for calling at exactly the right moment." "Sisters always know," Margaret replied softly, even after all these years. 3 months later, Dorothy sat in her kitchen sharing morning coffee with Margaret, who had moved back to town after her own divorce. The cardiac rehabilitation had gone well, but the emotional healing had been even more profound. Her children visited regularly now, not out of worry, but out of genuine joy in spending time together. The conversations had shifted from concerns about her safety to excitement about her plans. Dorothy had kept her house, but she'd also made changes. A medical alert system she actually wore, not because her children demanded it, but because she recognized it as a tool for maintaining her independence. Weekly dinners with Margaret had become sacred time, filled with laughter and memories they'd thought were lost forever. Most surprising of all, she'd started a support group at the community center for seniors who'd experienced medical emergencies alone. "You know what I've learned?" Dorothy said, watching Margaret add cream to her coffee in the same careful way she had as a child. "We spend so much time after 60 worrying about becoming a burden that we forget we might still have gifts to offer." Margaret smiled, like teaching other people how to save their own lives. Dorothy nodded. The group had grown to 12 members, each with their own story of facing crisis and discovering unexpected strength. They practiced the 7 life-saving techniques together, but more than that, they talked about the deeper lessons. How senior resilience wasn't about never needing help, but about knowing when and how to ask for it. How dignity didn't come from perfect self-sufficiency, but from making thoughtful choices about the kind of support that honored who they were. Sarah called every Sunday now, not to check up, but to share stories about the baby and ask for advice about motherhood. David had started bringing his teenagers to visit, and Dorothy found herself rediscovering the joy of being needed for her wisdom rather than worried about for her vulnerabilities. The quiet victories were the sweetest ones. Successfully managing her medications, yes, but also the courage to call Margaret when she felt lonely. Maintaining her independence, absolutely, but within a network of relationships that made that independence more meaningful rather than more isolated. Dorothy had learned that the most timeless lessons often came disguised as crises. That night, when her heart faltered, everything else had clicked into place. She discovered that growing older didn't mean growing smaller, that asking for help could be an act of strength, and that sometimes the people we push away are exactly the ones we need to pull closer. Now, as she looked across the table at her sister and heard her phone buzz with a text from Sarah sharing a photo of the baby's first smile, Dorothy understood something fundamental about life's second chapters. They weren't about proving you could still do everything you'd always done. They were about having the wisdom to choose what truly mattered and the courage to build a life around those choices. The heart attack had saved more than her life. It had saved her relationships, her sense of purpose, and most importantly, her understanding of what it meant to age not just gracefully, but joyfully.